Welcome to Week 5, Presentation 2. This presentation will conclude our cultural or subculture theories, and it's going to focus on one work in particular, and that is of Elijah Anderson, and his 2000 text, Code of the Street, Decency, Violence, and the Moral Life of the Inner City. Elijah Anderson is a sociologist. At the time, he was at Temple University in Philadelphia, and he studied African American neighborhoods along Philadelphia's Germantown Avenue. And he studied them closely for a period of about 2 years, in which he offered a very descriptive analysis of what he observed and what he thought it meant. While he was studying in a particular city and what have you, you read the full text, his argument is essentially a macro argument where he's trying to explain all city youth, regardless of whether they're in inner city, Philadelphia, or what have you. And his basic view of human nature is neutral. He argues that people are not born criminals, they're born neutral, and they can go either way. In part, while it's a subculture theory, definitely has conflict elements where he argues that youth are in conflict with both each other and conventional society. So this is definitely a twist on previous concepts. However, he has a very narrow domain because he's only looking at African American inner city adolescents, as I said. And his focus is on violence and not things like shoplifting or what have you. Anderson had a three-part goal. First, he wanted to understand the roles of violence in the social organization by inner-city youths. Second, he wanted to understand how violence is revealed in interactions. And third, he wanted to understand or discuss the connection of violence to public social organization or the nature of public life. And Anderson essentially had a very interesting epiphany. In Philadelphia, Germantown Avenue goes from one end of the city to the other end, and from the one end to the other, block by block, it goes from one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the Philadelphia area to the most deprived neighborhood. As he opens the book, you follow along his narrative as he walks you block by block how things change block by block, how there is a gradation of cultural expectations and norms. And he wanted to be able to understand or explain what it was. In part, he wanted to be able to explain what it is that allows people to sort of float in between these different subcultures and what have you. And he comes to a conclusion that there are essentially two different kinds of inner city of individuals, those he called decent and those he called street. If you look real closely at the decent, clearly there's a connection here with middle class values, the hope for the future, value hard work, accepting mainstream or middle class values. However, what he argued was in his book is that they are at risk because they live around the street people, which we'll talk about in a second. So one of the things he looked at very closely in his book in Code of the Street is the ability for people to understand both the culture or code of the street, but also be able to switch between sort of the decent or middle class code as well as the street. And with respect to the street, he argued had a number of characteristics, some of which are listed there. I'm going to add a little bit there. He basically argued that there's a lack of consideration for others, a very superficial sense of community. I mean, he would argue that, when somebody dies or gets killed in a drive-by or a gang-related shooting, nobody will tell the cops who did what because nobody wants to snitch. But they'll all go to a public ceremony where they'll put teddy bears all over the sidewalk where the person was gunned down. To Anderson, this is an example of the superficial sense of community. The street people or street families socialize their children into the street code, he argues, and they judge themselves and others by their individual values, their subcultural street values. And he argued that many of them feel very bitter because they are treated unfairly, because of lack of jobs and discrimination. And there's a connection, obviously, here to anime and the stress component. For people in the street, they're quick to resort to violence, and they are so focused on the present that they lack a desire or ability to see past it. And lastly, they have a serious level of pride of their code and defiance of the law, a purposeful, willful disrespect towards the system. And I think these two pictures of these two little girls, probably roughly the same age, illustrate for Anderson the difference between the street kid and on the right and the decent kid on the left. The decent kid looks like she could be in any neighborhood, looks like a quote unquote a proper little girl, whereas the one on the right is blinged out. And actually that picture, the caption that goes with that picture, she and her mom, who is cut off there, both dressed up as the Kool-Aid guy, with the spiky hair and the surfer dude, whatever. For Anderson, the code begins the development of different types of cultures. Street justice and people's law began because residents do not like or trust the police and need to keep their own safety. People must protect themselves since the police won't. And status is important to protect oneself. Secondly, because of situational factors, some residents form an oppositional culture, and because of these structural deficiencies. So you can see here that there's linkages to other theoretical frameworks we've been looking at. Going further into the development of the code, there's clearly a cultural economic connection, as we'll dive a little more into in the next couple slides. There are also structural factors. Anderson argues that there has been a growth and transformation of the underclass, and it is in part the result of the economic changes in the country's public policy and deindustrialization. For blacks in particular, there's a lack of jobs due to a lack of education, skills, training, and network. And by the way, if you paid really close attention, moreover, there's been a decrease in government help as the welfare system has dramatically changed since the mid-90s and people were getting cut off. And for the same people, for the street people, there's a limited public service, a lack of police response, building maintenance, lighting. It's kind of like the broken windows effect, which we'll talk about in a later presentation. Thus, people become socially isolated and they have to improvise, which is why the oppositional culture is developed. For followers of the code, they are isolated from mainstream society. And it's harder for decent people to be completely civil because of their environment and battle between conventional society and street survival. There is a need to adhere to the code for survival reasons. In other words, it's critical to be able to code switch. What has further developed as the 80s turn to the 90s for Anderson was the major structural and economic changes. At the end of the day, there was less jobs. Well, what happened? Well, a lot of the manufacturing jobs for people with less education moved overseas or required greater levels of education as it became service jobs and high technology jobs. And he argues communities are produced by economic forces, and the neglect of the economics of public life and the culture is a result of frustration and the inability to thrive. Thus, the development of the code leads to the weakening of the social and family structure because children are not socialized into mainstream society. The next couple images are meant to sort of illustrate some of the street behaviors that Anderson is getting at. So, for example, you have a single mother who may have 3 children, maybe 4, whatever, all of whom have different fathers, and none of the fathers live at home. This is a really important aspect of Anderson's work, which is the single mother, or the children being raised by the grandparents, or the father who is a gang member and is teaching his very young child how to do gang signs, or the regularity of violence in the street resulting in the death of children, and this being an everyday or such a common occurrence, and where it's more important to show up at the funeral, put the teddy bear in the street, but not provide information to the police if you know it, because somebody might do harm to you because you're violating part of the code of the street, which has to do with no snitching. Now here's an interesting question. In the burbs, you might be saying, oh, if this was in the burbs, you might be saying they're playing cops and robbers, and the kid on the ground is the robber, and the kids with the guns are the cops. But in fact, for these kids, it's the opposite. The kid on the ground was playing the cop, and the kids playing with the guns are the robbers. And there's a glorification of the robbers over the cops in terms of, what's cool and what's to be aspired to. I don't even know what to say about this. Really. I'm just going to go on. As a consequence of the deindustrialization and the lack of jobs, there has developed a very strong sense of an underground economy. Whereas children and residents are relatively deprived of the material goods and opportunities. Therefore, poverty and alienation and the underground economy are connected. Joblessness and difficulty finding jobs leads to the underground economy. And joblessness further leads to the feelings of alienation, which leads to drug trade as a fine justification for getting rich or dying trying. The development of an oppositional culture is going against conventional society, but is needed for survival. If one comes from a bad neighborhood, they have respect in the communities, but are looked negatively by conventional society. The resident is demonized. This affects the decent individuals who are good because they don't get the jobs and sometimes need to adopt the code to build self-esteem and, most importantly, protection. They are further alienated from society. That decent individual may be more likely to revert to the street code, but as a consequence, they become less employable and are considered indecent. For Anderson, what's the answer? Well, the solution to the code is more government help. Now, take a side trip here into some of the policies of the 1960s. There are arguments out there, especially made by social economists, that say, a lot of these programs that are supposed to bring government help, in fact, are the cause of the disturbances in some of the inner city relationships. As one becomes more reliant on the government, they become less able. Thus, the government disables their capacity to have a say in their own fate, because their fate is dependent on the largesse of the government, which means that they are reliant on the government for all their sustenance. Anderson argues that there are essentially 4 different cultural dimensions to the street, which are listed there, and I'm going to go through them in detail right now. First is campaigning for respect. For Anderson, there are types of social capital which are linked to the symbolism of respect and authority, and respect takes the place of money. Some people obtain respect through violence and threats, and disrespect can be verbal and physical. In other words, because you are relatively deprived and don't have, say, wealth, your form of wealth, or the currency of wealth in the street, is your respect. And if people take that away, then what you have to fight for that back. Thus, respect is important when you don't have other forms of capital. It provides self-esteem and protection. However, it leads to breakdown of civil law because respect is a form of personal defense, and there's a distrust in the system which is, quote, protecting white Americans. Thus, this leads to a great emphasis on people's law, which is based on respect. Vengeance and payback is a means of maintaining or achieving respect. Juice is a reference to respect. It's sort of street slang. And image is important, and the ability to have a tough physical appearance that will emphasize people's respect, as well as physical material goods. If you have very cool sneakers or a hat or whatever it is. One form of status is taking possessions from others, material, clothing, whatever, or immaterial. These are the 2 ways of achieving status. And people demand respect through their presence. Possessions, body language, they speak for themselves. They sometimes don't have to campaign for themselves. If you don't have this, though, you need to fight in order to obtain the respect on the street. In other words, to get respect, you might have to take someone else away or belittle another. In other words, respect in this regard is a zero-sum game. Now, the next couple of slides are meant to sort of illustrate the materialistic as well as toughness sort of concept that Anderson is getting at, such as the movie Get Rich or Die Trying, which illustrates both the toughness aspect as well as the statement of getting rich as a way of getting respect. Then there's also the materialistic goods, and you actually see these in inner city neighborhoods. One of the inner cities where I work, people do things like this with their cars a lot of the time. I don't know why it is, but for some reason Cheetos seems to be pretty popular here in New Orleans. Or you have these blinged out shoes with gold-plated laces. Or Gucci. It doesn't matter if it's real or fake. The one on the left is fake. The one on the right is real. But Louis Vuitton is a very popular brand, as illustrated here, where somebody has Louis Vuitton, their Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme, or their house. The next dimension is social shuffling. And in this relates to the children and how they are taught and influenced by the street, which obviously links to learning theories. However, the streets undermine the socialization of home, or, depending if it's a street-oriented house, maybe it reaffirms. But, therefore, the home environment does not determine the success of the child. Other factors need to be taken into consideration: neighborhood and environmental factors. Social and economic opportunities within the neighborhood are key for adoption of the code. And the fact is that decent and street kids sometimes interact and are sometimes friends. However, the students learn violence for protection, and they also learn to be cautious. There's also a very important aspect of the socialization of violence. And the code is observed in other young as well as in street-oriented individuals, and one can never break back down from a fight. In fact, in his text, he actually has a couple of examples where kids have to pretend like they're fighting in order for everybody to see that they maintain their respect with each other or what have you. But meanwhile, it's like a play. It almost links back to Cohen in many respects. The next dimension has to do with staging areas, which is the places where people hang out and where a mix of people converge. Here, people campaign for respect. And there are 3 areas which are local, like the neighborhood, the liquor stores, whatever. There's the business strip, which is the stores oriented at working and poor, including multiplex theaters, sporting events, concerts, and lastly schools, which are most volatile because of the differences between people, and you have the greatest mix of different socioeconomic backgrounds. In any of these staging areas, the individuals must represent both themselves as well as where they are from and who they associate themselves with. Thus, physical appearance is important. What colors you wear, what brands you wear, etc., become increasingly important. Moreover, the school represents decency. However, they become inherited in street code, as troublesome students are then encouraged to act out by peers, get over on teachers, test authority by probing weaknesses. Ultimately, the street knowledge undermines the school mission. In fact, you can even take it further. For blacks, according to Anderson, attending school and doing well becomes negatively associated with acting white, whereas looks are important, and students are constantly searching for who they are relative to how other people look. And the fact, according to Anderson, teachers can't distinguish between the street and the decent kids because of attitudes and attire. But it's here where the kids really develop who they are, and what they will be. But, according to Anderson, the decent kids can code switch behaviors in school and outside. And therefore, school, for Anderson, is the critical microcosm of the community, in a sense. Although police and disciplinarians are on patrol, kids are parading up and down the halls, socializing, even buying and selling drugs. And these same things occur in school or outside of school. So therefore, for Anderson, you really have to look at the school as like a sort of a special staging area. Lastly, with respect to the dilemma of the decent kid, Anderson argues that children really begin to develop their identity between the ages of 5 and 8, and it's the street where they process their identities. There is a natural tension between home and street, especially when family at home is trying to raise the kid to be decent, and the street is bringing tension to that. And Anderson talks about how bad groups of street kids usually have families who are unemployed and disorganized, but the decent kid has to interact with them, and they want to gain points. They want to be cool. They want to be seen as okay. They want to protect themselves from being seen as weak. So they want to gain points from the street kids through knowing the game. They need to keep the reputation, adopt a street look. And in these neighborhoods, according to Anderson, the coming of age is no longer about doing homework, obeying teachers. It's where your grades drop and you start to get more involved with doing quote-unquote street activities. However, the family doesn't see, in the decent kid, the family doesn't see the street kid because he code switches both at home and outside. Some decent kids get to the point where they don't want to code switch anymore and they just adopt street values. Unfortunately, though, either way, whether you're a decent kid who has to code switch within the community, outside society only sees street kids and they can't differentiate. And that's because at the end of the day, the decent kid still needs the street knowledge to survive in the urban areas. And while some kids continue to show commitment to decency through church, work, home, whatever, they can't always do so, so they are encouraged to code switch to survive. Since Anderson's ideas are really a descriptive sort of analysis of what he sees and what he observed, it's not about per se coming up with public policies and things like that. And like any ethnography, which is field research where the researcher goes and observes directly his subject matter, while he tries to position this as a sort of I don't want to say universal, but let's say he's not making the argument that this is just about Germantown Avenue, this is more generalizable. He also argues that that's for further people and for further researchers to test or evaluate. And while 10 years old may not sound like it's quote-unquote cutting edge, real new theories slowly develop, and so we're actually cutting edge and pretty new sort of theoretical framework that still needs to be further tested. But if nothing else, it provides a very interesting narrative in terms of explaining different behaviors, especially in inner cities where a lot of our violence occurs. Now, the next two presentations are going to go into a very specific aspect of social structure theories, and that is social disorganization. And if you don't recognize the aerial view in front of you, that's Chicago. And as you'll discover pretty shortly, that's an important aspect of the next presentations. So we're done for now.